Okay, good morning, everybody. It's 10 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started with the standard purchase requisition workflow. So today we'll go into a kind of a deep dive into using the workflow. And our agenda here is a overview of what it is. And then we'll explore purchase requisitions, purchase orders, vouchers, justifications, and close partial POs. As we work through today's agenda, if you have questions at any point, please use the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen. I'll be monitoring that so I can answer your questions as we go through. And then this training is being recorded, so once this is done, I'll make sure to email a link to this so you can view this again, and a link to the slide deck I'll be going through before we get into Intacct. So for our overview on the purchase requisition workflow, this is kind of taken from the accounting manual. So the procurement of materials and equipment and contract services will be facilitated through a purchase order system. The requisition form will be completed and includes the following information: date, vendor, description of the item being purchased, quantity, price, line item. Pretty much all the basic information we see when we're working in Intacct on purchasing requests. And then the last part of this is the request must be legitimate, appropriate, and supported by adequate budget. And so we'll look in how we can create all this information, look at our budget and all of that. Typical workflow for the purchase requisition is, as we see on the screen. The first step is creating a purchase requisition, which is the responsibility of the program that has the request. This is the document we submit to obtain approval and verify that budget is available to accommodate the request. Once that is approved by the two approvers who approve that, which is the department head and a program monitor, the program can then convert this into the next step, which is a purchase order. The purchase order is the formal document your vendors would expect to see, which has a purchase order number. It has the duplicated signature of the treasurer, and it's the formal document you can print that indicates you have gone through the necessary approval to obligate funds for that purchase. And then the final step is we have a decision to make with our purchase order now. Are we going to pay it through a voucher? Did the amount that we got billed exceed the amount we requested, so we need to request a justification? Or are we not going to pay the bill, like we didn't use the purchase order, so we need to close the purchase order through a closed partial PO? So this is our hierarchy for the workflow and the decision tree we have once we're ready to pay. Basic part of this is working through the tribe's general ledger, which is the record keeping system for the tribe's financial data. It's the master records for any financial transactions for us. All debits and credits through purchasing are created automatically. The general ledger provides a record of each financial transaction that takes place during the life of the tribe, and more specifically, the funds you're using. We use a double entry accounting system, as everybody does. And an example I give here is once we have approval for a standard purchase requisition, the following entry gets generated. Your expense account is debited, and a credit is placed against the encumbrance control account. So an approved purchase requisition creates an encumbrance in that manner. And so once we get to the stages that we're going to clear the encumbrance through payment or through closing the purchase order, the opposite transaction takes place in which we credit the expense account and debit the encumbrance control. I got a big table up here on screen that just gives us each step along the way. So the first item or first row, which is the grayed out row, this is the document that creates our commitment, our encumbrance, the standard purchase requisition. That's that journal entry we were just looking at. When we create the purchase order from the purchase requisition, there is no general ledger impact with your purchase order. There's no payment that's submitted. It's just the middle document we need so we can print that formal approval, that purchase order document. The purchase order can then be converted into either a payment request, which is the voucher or justification. So That's the document that's going to release a commitment and then post an expense. Or if we close the purchase order, we convert the purchase order to a closed partial PO. That's the document that releases the commitment, but that one posts no expenses since we're closing the purchase order. So when does a purchasing transaction impact our general ledger? It's when all approvers in the workflow have approved it, not any time before. So just because we've created or submitted a purchase requisition, that doesn't mean our budget's been hit yet. So this means that the budget availability is not affected until after a document is approved. So that means we need to watch out for multiple submissions that we think are within budget. And we need to be checking our financial reports anytime we create a document. And so the basic example for this one is if I created a purchase requisition for $100 and I had a budget of $100, submitting that request doesn't take away the budget yet until it's fully approved. So I could continue to submit requests until something is approved, since budget is not impacted. So I could submit $1 million and $100 requests, and not until one of those documents is fully approved will Intacct then recognize that budget's been impacted because now we have an approved document. Encumbrances do not clear until after your payment request is approved. So if we're preparing a payment from one of our purchase orders, we've converted the PO into our voucher, we've submitted that for approval, the encumbrance doesn't go away yet until it goes through the approval process. After submitting our purchasing request and getting approval, please make sure to check your financial reports, check purchasing reports, and then check them again so that you know the thing you're expecting to happen has. And the last part of our overview before we get into purchase recs is this is the amended resolution regarding our procurement policy. And so when we're preparing our purchase requisitions, functionally this is what a program monitor is looking at its basic level to make sure we've adhered to. Purchase orders are required for purchases of $100 to $800. Vendor selections by the discretion of the director. There's no bid requirement. $800 to $1,200, a purchase order is still required. Telephone bid or documentation is required. Over $1,200, we start to look for written bids on letterheads. And then over $10,000, formal advertising is expected with a bidding process for our purchase requisitions. And then monitors, of course, would also be verifying that beyond the own tribe's procurement policy are your requests within the guidelines of your funds. Whether it's a grant who has a funding agency that requires certain information or pre-approval, that kind of stuff, the monitors would be checking for that as well. So here's the standard purchase requisition workflow. Step 1, user creates a standard purchase requisition. Once they've submitted that request, it moves to the next step in our process, which is the program approver. They have a decision to make to approve or decline. Whichever decision they choose to make, there's no bearing on our general ledger yet at this point. So if they decline, it returns back to the original starting point, to the user that created it. If they approve, it goes to the program monitor and they have the same decision to make, approve or decline. If they decline, it goes back to the very beginning. If they approve, general ledger is affected. This journal entry over here is made in Intacct on your general ledger using the information from the purchase requisition. And of course, the user that created the request would get a notification by email that their request has been approved. And you put the same document here in a table. The user submits a request. The state of the document is going to say submitted. No journal entries are made. Step 2 is the program approver. When it's waiting for them to approve, the state of the document still says submitted. If they decline, the status changes to declined. If they approve it, it'll change to partially approved. No journal entries are made because their approval isn't the final approval needed for this to be final. Lastly, the program monitor can review. So if it's with a monitor, it's going to say partially approved as the document stat. Once they've made a decision, the status will change to either declined if they declined it, or to approved, it would change to pending. And then depending on the line items used, I used office supply in this example, this would be the journal entry that gets made for your encumbrance. But of course, that's not until the monitor approves, and now we have both approvals for the document. Once we've submitted a document, it cannot be edited. It's important because we have certain fields that need to be used, so if we didn't use them correctly, it may cause a delay because now we can't make a change to it until we decline it so it can go back to a state that we can edit the document. So if we used an incorrect line item, funding source, that kind of stuff, it may end up causing a delay in your request, and of course your request being declined because of that. All declines start the process over. It doesn't just go back to the step beforehand, it goes back to the very beginning. Your budget is verified when a user submits a purchase transaction. So things we need to make sure that, does the line item for your funding source have the funds available to accommodate that request? Upon submission, budget is not affected. Budgets are affected when the request is fully approved. Cannot repeat that enough for some of the requests that we get about our transactions. And it's important to understand that because you can submit multiple requests that meet an existing budget individually, but in totality, they can exceed your total available balance. So as you're preparing your request, make sure you take that into consideration while you're submitting these things. Typically, they're approved in the order they're received. So like the default approval view for a program monitor just lists the most current one that was prepared. So they're not necessarily picking and choosing which ones to approve. So if one of those get approved and the rest cannot, because they all met the budget originally and now an approval reduces your budget, that's something that can happen to you. So make sure you're aware of that before you submit your request. Well, let's get into standard purchase requisitions. At this point, most of us are probably logged in. We go to our menu on the top. We can go to purchasing, to quote, and then to purchase requisition. If we're adding a purchase requisition, we can hit just the plus sign and go right into creating one. If we click the text for purchase requisition, it's going to take us to a list of all the transactions available to us based on what our access level is. So based on some of the names here, if we worked in MAP 21, Hoya, Spotted Tail Children's Homes, when you log in and go to the screen, you would see the information you have access to. And so for like us in finance, we're not restricted to any specific sort of funds. So I get brought to a screen with 56,000 purchase requisitions throughout the life of Intacct. So we can use that information to search if we wanted to search vendors' names, the state of one of those, declined or pending, partially approved, by date. All of those are available for us to search. There are custom views. If we click on the all on the left screen, there are some available to you. So for example, the created by now adds more information about who was the person that created it and the dollar amount of what the request is for. I do have other videos available. If we go to manage view, you can create your own view specific to something you would want to see. So you're welcome to go to either the training website that you guys registered on, ljstraining.info, or go to my YouTube page, LJ Moran. And there's just a video that just shows you how to create your own custom views. And that's available on any screen that lists transactions. So So we're back at the all. If we're going to search for a vendor name, for example, Golden West, the Intacct search boxes read left to right. So if I started typing Golden and hit enter, it's going to bring up anything that starts with the word Golden. So we have it that way as a way to search. Or if we wanted to know anything that had the word West in it, if I typed West, Golden West disappears because Intacct is reading what I've typed left to right. And West is not the first letters of Golden West name. A percentage sign is what Intacct calls a wildcard. So if I type the percentage sign and then West, it'll start finding any occurrence where the vendor name has the word West in it. So that can be valuable for you in searching for previous requests. All right, so we're going to work on adding a purchase requisition. If we click the plus sign on the menu options, or we can go up here to the top and click add. So here we are with the purchase requisitions. The very first thing that should draw our attention on this is that the date field is what's highlighted. That's the first thing we need to address. Now we are in a new fiscal year, so in this deal we'd expect to see that the date of our standard purchase requisitions is going to be the current date. But whatever date we have here, when this document gets approved, that's the date Intacct will use to create your encumbrance. So today is October 13th, and with that date on there, if I submit this request and it doesn't receive full approval until 2 weeks from today, the general ledger entry is going to say October 13th. So the approval date doesn't matter, it's the date on this document. If I dated this for 9/30 and it gets approved today, the general ledger entry is going to post to 9/30. So this date is super important for users to make sure that's the thing we start at. And granted, probably the majority of ours use the default day, so not too big of a thing to worry about, but it is important to what we're doing. Our next field that we'll be concerned with is vendor. So we'll stick with Golden West on this one. Just like the search field, this field is going to read left to right. So if I started searching for Golden West, I could click this drop-down box and search through the first 5,000 people that's listed and hope I can find them. Or we can just start typing the name of our vendor. And as we type, Intacct will start matching what we're looking for. So we can see that there's two options for Golden West. One is used for like internet and server type transactions, and then the telecommunications used for our phone bills. So if we're paying a phone bill, certainly would be using the second one. So that's one option we have to find our vendors. If we weren't sure of the vendor name or where it could be located, Golden West is a pretty easy one. Or if we weren't sure, we do have the option here to view and to find. So if I click find, it's going to take me to a list of all the vendors. And I can do the same thing, start looking for Golden West, and then select the vendor I'm looking for. So if we're not sure, we want to find and then start using this to search for who we are. Like we knew the word test was in the vendor's name, but we weren't sure of the vendor. So I do the wildcard, the percentage sign, and then test. And now we've reduced that list to a lot smaller to who it might be. So if it was American Engineering Testing, there we are, I can select them. And now they're filled in on the sheet for us. But we are going to use our testing vendor. The expiration date on this request is required. It's not a field we use for the way we use Intacct. So even though it's not required, we need to make sure it's there. Typically everyone's going to have a default date that just sits there, but on occasion, if that's not filled, you would get an error asking for you to have a date there. For our purchase requisitions, the reference, vendor document, message fields are all fields you can use to communicate information. That would be important for you. These fields are searchable on the custom list view. So if we created a custom view for us and we wanted this information, this is stuff that we can search when we're looking at our list of purchase requisitions. So if we're communicating something or we want to use something valuable, use that here. I think it was Mary might have had a comment on hers of wanting to have like the funding source put here, so you can search by a funding source out on the list view. If I have that right for you, Mary. The attachment field here is where we're going to attach the documents that support our request. So we'll come back to this one here in a minute. Authorized purchasers, if we're sending someone actually to the store, we could put their names here. This field prints on the purchase order itself. So if we were sending somebody to Turtle Creek or Allstop or wherever, we wanted to make sure that that's the authorized person, put their name here so that the business can see that that's the person we're sending on our behalf. So once we've put the information in these fields that we want to use, it's now time for us to add our line entry information. And so this is where we're going to specify where we want things to be charged to. First and foremost, hopefully we know our program. So you can type in the program number or the program name. I'm not very good with the numbers, so I usually use names, but I have a test program name, so that's what we're going to use. Which funding source is the one you can use to charge your request to? So that's the next step that you would have to be able to fill in here. So I have a test funding source we're going to use called Test for Training. Once we select the funding source, the checkbook autofills for us. So we're good there. And now we can select the line item we want to charge. You hit the drop-down box, you get a list of the line items available to you that's been assigned to the funding source. So we have motel, telephone, fax, office supplies. So this is going to be a request for office supplies. Class is a required field, so more than likely it's going to be regular, so we'll use regular. And the memo field is where we can specify whatever it is we're buying. So if we knew like the model number or something, maybe it'd be something like that we're going to have. How many of these things are we buying and what is its cost per item? So it's a very cheap box of ink. It's one of them for 10 bucks. And at this point, still a few things we can do. If we needed to verify our budget, above our line entry, there's a box that says Show Spend Insight. So any of these workflows that verify budget has this button available to you. So if I click this, it's going to run a financial report for us real quickly, and it's going to give us the information from our line entry. Here's test company, checkbook, funding source. There's that office supply number. Here's its budget. The actual posted expenditures are $0, so I don't have anything currently expensed to this account. There are no current committed expenditures, so there's no open purchase orders. This purchase request is 10 bucks, so if I were to get approval, when this is done, the amount available afterwards would be $90. And of course, it's basing this on things that have actually posted, not things that we've submitted. So please keep that in mind. If we have multiple lines of request, so now I've added a telephone line expense, and we go back to Show Spend Insight. It'll give us the read for both. So in order by the account numbers, there's the telephone line item, there's its budget, nothing expense, no purchase order open, so there's no encumbrances. This request is 5 bucks, so when over funds available would be $195 once it's fully approved. And then there's the line for the second budget. So a valuable tool for us already off the jump that we don't need to be surprised by what's happening to our budget. We can check here before we go anywhere else. And of course, the attachments we need to talk about here. So attachments, they're necessary for us to provide our supporting documents. From the screen that had the procurement policy that was approved by resolution, we would know that an amount this big, we don't need to have a quote here. We're not going to have a bid because the dollar of request here is underneath that threshold. But one of the things we do require for the vendors is that we have what's called an EPLS attached for our request. So we can do that by going to a second internet screen. There's one available through OIG, which I think might be the most common one that people are using. We can come here, go to their online searchable database, and I'm gonna search for my entity, which is testing vendor, which is just as it's entered into Intacct. No results, which is a good thing. If there was a result, that means testing vendor was determined to have violated some sort of rules out there, or they likely committed fraud on using government funds. So we need to be able to use this to attach to our documents. Easiest way is to print your screen, especially if you're using Chrome as your for your internet, for your browser. This gives us the option to save as a PDF. So now we can save this document to our desktop or wherever it is we want to save them. So I'm giving it a clear name, the date I ran it, who the vendor is, and what type of document it is. And so now we can add that attachment here. There's two ways to add an attachment. Hit the drop-down box and click Add. And then we can browse our desktop, find our attachment, and click Open, and now it's attached. And then we can save. Or if it's easier for us, rather than going through those steps, I'm going to clear that out so we have no attachment. On my desktop is that document. I can also just click and drag it to the document itself, and it attaches for me. And this does work with multiple requests. So if I had another document I wanted to attach, now we should have two documents. So when we go to view this attachment, there's this document and there's the original one I added. Very easy to do. And once we're satisfied with the request, they're already saved, so I don't have to click Save. That document is there. So now we've got our attachments, we have our line items prepared. We have testing vendor, we got all our business ready to go. Now we can submit this request. We come back out to our view. Here's my testing vendor. Let's get all the others sorted out of there. We can see the request as submitted. Okay. So what does that mean? If we click on submitted, it's going to take us to a page from the request that says history, and I can click on approval history and I can see where the things are going. So the first approver is the program approver, which for this one, Lynette's the assigned person. So it says it's submitted to her. The second approval says value approval, which is a group designation for a program monitor. And so it's pending their approval. They can't make a decision yet until the first person does. And so it's Lynette we would be questioning to take action on this. So Lynette, if you could approve that for me, please. While we're in this position and I go to add a new request, we're going to use the same information. We'll use testing vendor. We're going to use that test funding source and the line items for it. Wrong funding source. This one's going to be a $10 request as well. So we know right now the document is not fully approved, our original request. So if I go to show spend insight, still nothing expensed against it, but more importantly, there's no committed expenditure yet because that first request is not approved. So while you're preparing your request, keep that in mind. Keep your own list to the side until you get approval. Mary, can you approve that request for me, please? So after that's approved, our budget would get impacted. So we're gonna go ahead and draft this, and we'll come back to it later. So we can see the state here says partially approved. Lynette has done the first approval. So if we look at the approver history, now that Lynette's approved, it fills in her name, the date she approved. And if she had any comments, there would be a comment here that she could add. So if we're getting something declined, please keep that in mind. A comment would be there. It'd either be in your email or you can look at it directly here. And now the state changed on the monitor level from pending approval to submitted. All right, so Mary says she has approved that. So if we go back into this document, I'm gonna refresh the screen here. That has changed to pending now. And if we go back to the approval history, Mary's name now filled in. Of course, originally it just says value approval, so there's no specific person to list until they've taken action. And there's the date and approved. The status on our request changed to pending. So now anytime as a user we see pending, that typically means for us that is action that we need to take as a user, especially at the purchase requisition level. It's not quite ready yet as a purchase order. Now that we've gotten our full approval, we need to convert this to a purchase order so we can get this to our vendor. But let's take a look at the requisition I had placed into draft. Now when we go to show spend insight, now we have a $10 expenditure for this one line item. It was a 2-line request, but the other line was the phone line. So now we have just the one from the request that we're making here on the draft. There's the $10 expenditure. So now with this $10 request, it would move the funds available to $80. So easy enough for us to follow along there and keep an eye on what's happening to our requests. If we thought we were finished here and we decided to print this document, PDF will pop on screen. This one isn't the official document of the tribe, so this shouldn't be accepted anywhere, provided there is no PO number, just a PR for purchase requisition. So we have a new step to take. So we have a convert line on screen for us, and our only option is to convert this to a purchase order. So we'll take those steps. At this stage, when converting from a requisition to a purchase order, there is no reason for us to make any changes to this document. So the only thing I'm going to do now is click post. So let's sort this to just testing vendors. Our requisitions have the draft, and now that one has changed from pending to converted, telling us that we have done something to this document, so it's no longer available to be moved anywhere else. If we look at that history of this, below now, the document history for the requisition has when the requisition was created and when it was last modified, meaning approved, and now what it's become converted to. So the second document is now the purchase order. And we can see the converted state here. So if we were looking at this one purchase requisition, we know that we have something waiting for us at the purchase order level now for us to take action with. Now that this document's approved and we know that it affects the general ledger, we have posting details. This is telling us what general ledger entries have been made as a result of our request. It's telling us the journal that was used, the transaction number, the days, each line it represents on the general ledger entry, the account numbers used, and of course the dollar amounts. Important to know how our budget's affected by that. Here's the specific entries and lines. So now we can go to the purchase order itself. So I'm going to order and purchase order. And we're going to go to the all default view. Here's our testing purchase order. It's now assigned a PO. So if I go to print that document, the PDF will show up on screen. There it is. First signal to us that it's the official one is it's red. And we have the treasurer's signature here. And then there's the PO number in the corner. We had included an authorized purchaser. This field would have the name of that individual. And then of course, here's the program, the fund, the description of the line that was being used and the amounts and subtotals. All of this ready to go to our vendor, testing vendor. When we view this document, the attachment created at the purchase requisition level is also the attachment that's here for the purchase order. So they share the same folder. So the two documents I attached here are shared between both. So if I made a change to this folder while working on the purchase order, that affects the attachments that show for the requisition. So we want to keep that in mind. If we make changes and can't figure out what's happened to my EPLS, if we started a new attachment folder, well, that EPLS would no longer be included with the purchase order. We can email this document to our vendor. So like out on the screen, there was the print email option, or right in here, there's the print email option. Print's our default method. So I could uncheck this and click email. The vendor has my email assigned, so my email pops up as the person to receive the email. So depending on the vendor, it might have something else. Or if it's blank, you can always type in the email yourself if it was something else. We were going to copy it to somebody or blind copy it to somebody, we can fill in that information. What I want to bring up here though is this corner here, the from. I'm the default contact for Intacct, for the tribe. So anytime you use this option to mail to somebody, make sure that in this box we scroll down and you put your own information in. On occasion, vendors are contacting me to collect on unpaid purchase orders or have questions about people's purchases. So please remember to change this so that they can contact you directly. But once you've changed this to your information, you could click OK, and then Intacct will process your request to email that to the email address you provided. Okay, any questions about the purchase order or maybe even the attachments part? All right, if you do have questions, please use the bottom right chat box on your screen. When we're ready to pay, once we get our invoice, while we're in the purchase order workflow, we have the option to convert. If we're using the default all view, the convert is on the left. If you're using any other view, one you've created or one that's listed out there for us, like this created by user, for example, the convert button moves to the right. So it's on the left using the default view, it's on the right using a custom view. Either way, it's on the screen. When we hit convert, we have three options. We can close this purchase order. That means it closes it entirely. It does not send a payment request to anybody. It would close the document and the encumbrance would be removed and you can go on to your next business. We can use a justification. So if my invoices ended up exceeding the amount of request, we're going to use the justification and attach the appropriate approval from the treasurer. Or if we're just making a payment on our invoice is $15 or less, we're ready to pay, we can use the voucher steps. So let's go through this as if we were going to pay the voucher, and then we'll get to the attachment question. At this point, yes, we can make changes now. From requisition to purchase order, we don't want to, but from here, we need to make changes. The dates will always default to today, so we can see that there, it's highlighted blue. We can make that change, so if I change it to tomorrow, that changes, but so does the general ledger posting date. The general ledger posting date is just exactly as it says. Whatever date here is the date the transaction will post to the general ledger. So this is a FY21 transaction, so the current date would be just fine. If we were paying a bill from FY21, we need to make sure that we've changed this date to a 9/30/21 so that all of the clearing activity and expense activity will post to the proper period of time. If not, to clear your encumbrance, Mary would have to do 2 journal entries, and then to reclassify your expense, she'd have to do 2 more. So that'd be 4 journal entries because we didn't put the correct date. Mary probably doesn't want to do that. So before we move any further, let's make sure our dates are right for the time, for the period we're accruing our transaction to. Now at this point, we have a field that has a requirement of us. It's the vendor document number. This vendor document number becomes what's called a bill number in accounts payable, and it has to be unique by the vendor. So if I had used testing vendor before, and this was my vendor document number, I couldn't use it again. I'd have to make sure it's unique to this person. If we have invoice numbers, those are usually perfect. The invoice numbers are typically not repeating, and if you tried to use it here and you got the message that it's not unique, that could be a flag that we've paid it before. So if this was the invoice number, I might have invoice 456789. I'm ready to go. To my attachments, something I want us to be careful of here. If we now we're at this stage and we want to add an invoice. So I click the drop-down box. If I click add, that is not going to add to the current attachment folder. It's going to start an entire new attachment. So before I do that, I want us to keep track of what this attachment number is. That's the unique number Intacct assigned for that attachment I started at the purchase requisitions. 313912. So if I come here and click add, first signal to us something didn't go right is this is empty. If we were meaning to keep all of our attachments together, we've now stopped that chain from purchase rec to PO to this voucher. So now if we're going to add an attachment, and I click save, when we view this folder, it's just that one I've attached now. If we were going to try to fix this, of course we could add new attachments. I could go back to the other screen and drag the ones I had there. So when we go to view this box, there's all the attachments again, including now the new one. Here's that attachment ID, 313919. That's the new attachment one. The one that was originally there was 313912. So we know the original link to the documents is no longer there. Keep that in mind. So, typically you want to keep all your documents together. And we also want to make sure that they're clearly labeled so everyone can understand what your attachments are. Don't use the serial numbers from your scanner, please. If we made a mistake and my PEMDAS file doesn't need to be there, and I want to get rid of it, if we're a regular user of Intacct, meaning someone that works out in one of the programs, you do not have the option to delete this. So if I click edit, I have a trash can here that allows me to delete this attachment. As a user, you do not. So if you had made a mistake on this one, and now we need to get rid of that, and you don't want that there, you don't have the ability to delete this one file from this folder. You'd have to delete the folder in its entirety and then start your new one. So make sure you're managing the attachments okay so you don't have to run into the minor inconvenience that would be caused by that. Somebody had a question about how long the original should be kept. If you have an original piece of paper document, you're going to want to keep it for at least as long as your funds are still being used, particularly for grants. If it's a digital copy, you've now put that into Intacct, so it's stored here and accessible. So once we have whatever our attachments are going to be, so let's start an attachment there. I have my vendor document number. And if I can make adjustments here, if it didn't end up being $10, it was $7 for this, and this one is $5. I can now submit this for request to get payments approved for this request. So I'm going to go ahead and submit this request. My documents moved to converted. It's now we're going to invoice and then to voucher. My status is at submitted, meaning now it's back to the program monitor to approve and then the finance manager. If we were to look at the financial report for this activity, the encumbrances remain until those approvals are given. So for these ones, we don't need these approved. Lynette or Mary, we're just gonna let this sit until I delete it. But we need to keep that in mind that the original request, which was $10 and then $5, would remain encumbered until it's fully approved. When this posts, the $7 and $5 amounts would post as expenses, and the $10 and $5 encumbrances would clear. And as Lynette added here, any attachment we have with these documents is an official record of the tribe, number one. And number two, are subject to audit, meaning when they come to audit fiscal year 21 and they sample, they would be looking for the documentation to make sure we followed our procurement policies and that the requests that we made are legitimate, are reasonable, and allowed. So we have a question of, regarding attachments, how come we can't delete an item if needed? It's a permissions issue. Intacct doesn't allow employee users to be able to delete attachments. If our voucher is declined because we've paid it before, so our testing vendor voucher sitting here declined, so we have to imagine this has been declined. If we're not going to make this payment, our encumbrance still sits there open and holding against our budget. So we need to be able to clear that hurdle. So the last thing we'll talk about is, if this is declined, we can't do anything more with the voucher. The voucher can't be converted to something else. Our purchase order itself is going to say converted. So we need to make a decision here, which is we need to delete the declined voucher. So I'm gonna delete this item, check in the delete checkbox and click and delete here. And we're gonna go back to the order by going to purchasing, order, and purchase order. My testing vendor one is now here sitting as a pending item. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit close partial PO. The amounts here I'm gonna remain unchanged because I want those full amounts to clear and remove from our budget. The current date today is fine for this request because this request exists within fiscal year 22, so there isn't going to be a posting issue. If I were closing open purchase orders from fiscal year 21, I would be making this date change to 9/30. So I've got nothing else to change. I'm clicking post. It's going to give us a warning to make sure the transaction date you're using is for the correct fiscal year. If it's correct, go ahead and click post. So now we can bypass that warning for us. Purchase order is back to converted. The amount will clear in the next few minutes from our encumbrances. And if we go back to our purchase requisitions, we still have that draft one, so hopefully enough time is cleared. Sometimes it might be too fast here. But we can go back here to show spend insight. The $10 encumbrance from the closed PO is still sitting here. Intacct typically updates like every 10 to 15 minutes. So if you come immediately here and it's not there, just wait a few more minutes for that to refresh. If we have any questions about the purchase requisition workflow, all right. Well, thank you everybody for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.